Hello, I'm Ann Harris Williams, Assistant Professor of English at Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri, and I would like to welcome you to a discussion of African American literature. African American studies, or the study of the history, literature, and culture of African Americans, is a discipline which we as members of the scholarly community must continually reevaluate and nurture in order to remain current and viable, and to provide for students and professional scholars alike the necessary tools for continued study. Among the many issues we debate today is the role and scope of fiction by women of color. What does it mean to the scholarship and to classroom teaching to identify oneself as a feminist or a womanist? How do these identifications determine the sharing of information? We hope to find some of the answers to these and other questions today. Joining us today are Dr. Barbara Christian, Professor of African American Studies at the University of California at Berkeley, and Dr. Clenora Hudson Weems, Associate Professor of English at the University of Missouri, Columbia. Dr. Hudson Weems is the co-author of Toni Morrison, which is part of Twain's United States Authors series. She has recently published a work espousing her original critical theory entitled Africana Womanism, Reclaiming Ourselves. Dr. Christian is the author of numerous works of criticism, including Black Women Novelists, The Development of a Tradition, which received the Before Columbus American Book Award, and Black Feminist Criticism. Dr. Christian, Dr. Hudson Weems, thank you for joining me today. Dr. Christian, I'd like for you to begin. What does it mean to be a Black feminist, and how does a woman who identifies herself as such interface with the mainstream feminist movement?
Well, first of all, I want to make clear that what I'm going to say has to do with what I think it means to be a Black feminist. I'd say that there are many Black feminisms today. One of the reasons why I use the term is because I see it as a way of looking at the relationship between sexism and racism. And originally I thought in this country, I think increasingly internationally, that is the way in which sexism is often developed in a society, unfortunately, is through racist terms. And very often the way in which racism develops is through sexist terms. So, for example, the kinds of images that we associate with Black women and with Black men, and the way in which racism occurs in terms of the images projecting on us, are very often in terms of sexist terms, and vice versa. The term also is important for me because of the kind of political stance that it indicates. That it does not only mean that we love ourselves and cherish ourselves as women, but it also means that we take a political stance against that which tries to destroy us. So, and I also think it has a particularly important historical meaning. I often have students, Black women, who think of feminism as being primarily a white movement. And I have to remind them that the original feminists in this country, people like Sojourner Truth, are Black, that it is not a white movement. It perhaps was taken over by white women in the 1970s because they had access to the media, or in the 1920s because of the position that white women in this country occupy, that they were able to take control of that world. But we are very much at the forefront of that movement. The other reason why I think it's important to use the term is because it links us with women all over the world. For me, feminism has to do with women moving, a woman's revolution. So I would not only want to relate it only to African American women or African women, I also feel a connection with South American women, with Indian women, and so on. So that it's important for me to use the term feminist. However, Black, I think, is also very important because it indicates to us something about the way in which feminism is often seen as only white. So I want that corrective to always be there. I love the term womanism by Alice Walker, but I worry about the way in which it does not suggest that, because people are not aware of the term, a kind of political stance that I think we need to have in order to really indicate also that there's sexism within our own communities as well as without.
Okay, that clarifies quite a few things. Dr. Hudson Weems, you identify yourself in quite a different way. What does it mean to be an Africana womanist?
First of all, to be an Africana womanist to me suggests, first of all, that we're in control of naming ourselves and defining ourselves. And I come from an African cosmological perspective. And in African cosmology, nomo, it is through the proper naming of a thing that it gains its existence or essence. And I feel that in naming myself as opposed to being named and defined by the other is the kind of empowerment that I want to start off with, first of all. And then I want to be in control of an agenda that has not been already set up by those who are not necessarily at the same end of the spectrum as I am. When I think in terms of the feminist, I trace it back, for example, to the 1800s. I go back to the early female abolitionists, white female abolitionists, who were very, very animate and struggled very hard, along with other blacks as well, to abolish slavery. Somehow, obviously, feeling that their struggle would somehow, this struggle that they had would somehow benefit them too, because they were fighting for full-fledged citizenship, period. And that would obviously mean at some point for women. But what happened, ironically, is that the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870-71, I believe, and what that did, of course, was to give the black men the right to vote. Black women were very happy about it because they thought a vote in the black community was a vote for all of us, you know, and so their reaction to it was a very positive one. However, the reaction of that particular act for white women was just the opposite. They were very, very hostile, antagonistic, became overtly anti-black, because many of them felt that, you know, how is it that a black male can get the right to vote before me, and especially those who felt this white supremacy. People like Elizabeth Staten, I think, for example, who talked about preserving the sanctity of Anglo-Saxon blood and how the white men need to understand that they need to use the white female vote to counterbalance and to control this whole thing against the threat of you know, not only blacks but also immigrants as well. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the venomous beginnings of feminism. And I see that when I think about that and know that black women were not even on the agenda, that they were not accepted. And going back to Sojourner Truth, for example, when Sojourner Truth makes this famous oration on our woman, which has been considered in many circles the Feminist Manifesto, she was dealing in self-actualization, because in every instant she had to talk about, she had to resound, and aren't I a woman? Which means that she's dealing with more than herself as a female. But primarily it seems that since, after all, she was at a women's convention in Akron, Ohio in 1852. And she was hissed at and jeered at and ostracized, not because she was a woman, because she was among the community of women, but because instead she was black. And so she had to constantly say, and aren't I a woman? She was discriminated, ostracized because she was black. So it becomes very clear to me that this whole thing of race is very primary for us. It is the critical obstacle that we must combat, because before they can even hear her insightful information about the absurdity of female subjugation, for example, in her speech, they have to get beyond her color. So that, to me, suggests the need for prioritizing, and to be an Africana womanist is to deal with the triple plight of black women: race, class, and sex, but it's to deal with it in its order, in its proper order. And for me, the whole notion of prioritizing with race at the helm, because that is the thing that threatens us more than anything else, I believe, in the world. And when we get through fighting the struggle for females, we're going to be still black and at the bottom, and we're going to be still pushed aside. So I think that black women have a struggle that is uniquely our own. We have an agenda that is uniquely our own. And I disagree with the notion of early black women, for example, as being, you know, feminists or pre-feminists, because the feminists, that whole concept was named and defined by white women, and they were entitled to their own definition or own agenda, and the agenda did not include us. What happens, I think, is what happened rather is that I think they probably observed black women as being very, very verbal, for example. I mean, we come from a legacy of being very outspoken, you know. Black women are strong and outspoken. These were good things, and I could see someone observing this type of force and this type of power and saying, I like that too. so let's break the silence. Or to see black women who are co-workers with their male partners, because we could not afford the luxury of breaking off on the basis of sex. Even whites didn't even consider our sexuality. We were slave horses along with the with the black men, so side by side, you see. And so this whole notion of moving from the home place to the workplace, we have always been there. And yet that's the agenda for the feminists, to move from the home place to the workplace. I see all these things. I could see black women as sort of like the blueprint that white women have used in some way set up their agenda. And then when they set theirs up on the basis of what they observe to be a very, very free, emancipating stance, they named it the feminist movement, which I think is very appropriate for them. And I think they should keep its original intent is to deal with their concerns. Then we come along and we append to feminism black. I see it basically duplicating a duplicate. Because I think that what they're doing is, in a sense, using us as a model. So when we name ourselves after them, we're in essence duplicating the duplicate that they have created from their observation of us. And this is what I feel. This is why I feel so strongly that I must say Africana womanism, to deal with first ethnicity, the land base, and to deal with the concept of womanism, which for me evokes both, not Alice Walker, but Sojourner Truth and Aren't I a Woman. It also suggests all of the kinds of positions and research that's come out of Africa, for example, on black womanhood. So this is what it Aren't I a Woman, and this is what womanism means to me, okay, as opposed to what Alice Walker means when she says womanism, which is why I make a real point to make sure that we bring both those things in, because we are dealing with the dynamics of race, of cultural, background, as well as our femaleness, okay? And this is basically the way I feel about it.
It seems that the designations then are very important, at least to begin the dialogue. Dr. Christian, do you feel there have been reactions among women of color to the designation black feminist?
Oh, definitely. I think when we began using that term, I mean, this is a relatively new term in the early 70s, just as feminist as a term was really not used very much until the second wave. That it was extremely shocking, and I think that was part of its value. Part of its value was to indicate not that we were women only, but that we had certain political stances. Now, it may very well be that the term may need to change, but for a very long time, it put us in a debate, not only with white women, who I don't want to be focused on only, but in terms of women in the world, and also in terms of men within our own communities. I guess part of my sense of what needs to happen, and I know we'll be getting to that as well, is that in order for our communities to be strong, we need to recuperate some sense of what it means to be in those communities as women and men. And to some extent, those definitions were very much weakened from my readings in the 1960s, when there was a tremendous emphasis on manhood in black movements. I was certainly a part of them. And that part of what needed to happen, and we see writers like Audre Lorde and Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and so on being published right after that period, was to react and say that race, very often when we were talking about the term race in the 1960s, we all thought it meant women and men. And what we discovered, to a large extent within the movements, was that it meant maleness. In order to deal with that, we needed to come up with some kind of a critique, because we knew that would destroy our communities as much as racism, that they are related. It is one of the ways in which racism operates, is through sexist terms. So that I saw, for example, in the 1960s, and I lived through this period, where black women were told to walk 4 or 5 steps behind black men, right? We know this from the Karenga movement. I saw it myself. I saw the way in which black women were supposed to imitate, without black men knowing they were really doing this, white women in becoming quote-unquote black Madonnas who were quiet. I remember Baraka issuing a statement in which there was 10 commandments for the black woman, and the first one was that in the presence of a black man she should not speak. So that there is that intent in the term black feminism to indicate also within our communities that we will not become like white women in terms of the way white women have been or have been seen to be in their attempt to get out of that, very often within our own movements, we are told we should be like them. So that's a very important point. Another also, too, I think that I want to stress again, is that I think it's important for us to think about the international construct. And that in many ways, black women, African American women, Caribbean women, I'm from the Caribbean, have been very much at the center of being concerned about women moving all over the world. Coming from the Caribbean, where race is constructed somewhat differently from the way it is in this country, I know that we have had influences, the construct of an African Caribbean woman, on the way in which many other groups, and I do not mean just white people, they are after all a minority in the world, but other groups have been thinking about the way in which to define womanhood. So for me, it is the process that we're involved in now in looking at a traditional construct of African womanhood from which we come, along with a new world construct of womanhood, what Toni Morrison calls the new world African American. That we need to fuse African American woman. We need to fuse those in our movement into the 21st century. And we need to move towards new definitions of womanhood that are based on our tradition and are very much involved with the world as it now is. So the reactions then, I think, very often of women of color, and I note that you use the term woman of color, not only white women or black women, which we often divide the world into, of women of color, is that, for example, at Berkeley, I work very often, in my classes, I have what I call a United Nations of women and men from all over the world, from Bangladesh, from Nicaragua, where there are blacks, from Alaska, from Hawaii, where there are blacks, in other words, we need to really expand our definition of what we mean by that. That's number one. And then I work with, for example, this year I'm working with a woman from India who is looking at what she can learn from what African American women have done in this country in order to help Indian women and vice versa, because they are also going through a struggle. So I see it as both local, and also I think we're very much at the center, not only of racism in this country, but of colonialism, imperialism, the struggles around that internationally. So I think that's been one of the reactions. And of course then there's some people who see feminism, the term itself, only as white on one hand, and then there's some people who are white who see the term feminism as dangerous. And it's interesting to me why that word is such a provocative, dangerous word. And I guess I love the use of dangerous words to provoke discussion. Yes.
Very much so. Very much so. I think that's an interesting perspective on its usage around the world. And I'm curious also as to how women of color in this country and abroad have responded to the term Africana womanist.
And non-women of color.
Non-women of color.
This is very interesting because when I was in Nigeria, there were women from all over the world. Most of us, of course, were black. You know, we were from Africa, or we were African diaspora women, you know. But there were women, there was one woman, for example, who came up to me who was from Germany. And she said, you know, this is quite interesting. She said, I always thought of feminism as an umbrella under which all women can operate. But she said, but you're quite right. The agenda is pretty much set. And there's difficulty. And I talk about this difficulty of fighting for turf, which I don't like to do. You know, it's like every time, you know, this thing of race as being something very key that I got to deal with comes up, we say, let's deal with the commonality. We're after all women. We have that in common. So let's focus on our femaleness. We can't afford, I think, black women cannot afford to let that be a priority necessarily for them. We deal with that when there are circumstances where we got to deal with that. When we are being subjugated on the basis of our sex, then we must combat that. We can't tolerate any form of oppression, period. So we've got to combat that. But I think that overall, we have to deal with this thing that controls or limits us. And it's our color everywhere we go. Even in the Caribbean, I was down in Barbados. I spoke at university there last week. And I said, even though the blacks are in the majority here, they are informed by the dominant culture outside Okay, and one lady said, you know, the race issue is not the same here, the dynamic is true. She said, and what we're fighting, of course, is for economic parity. And I said, why isn't it so? She said, well, it seems that blacks are still, I said, aha, there's the term black again. We see that even when you're talking about the dynamics of the economy, you still can't get away from the color, which defines where you're going to be placed. So to me, obviously, that is very critical. Now, I have been speaking on Africana womanism since 1986 publicly, been working on it and speaking on it at the University of Iowa a lot since '85. But at any rate, I've had a lot of white students and colleagues, you know, around the states who said, you know, this Africana womanism and the agenda of the Africana woman is very interesting. First of all, how did you come up with the term Africana? And I told them what I was dealing with, ethnicity and gender. Okay, and they said the second thing is, if I buy into all of that, and it makes so much sense, everything that you're saying, that it's family-centered as opposed to female-centered, that it's self-naming and self-defining, it's all these other things, spiritual, you know, strength, respectful of elders, and, you know, all this stuff, mothering and nurturing, and all of this I believe in. I've had white women to say, I believe in that even more so than feminism. I wish we had a movement more akin to that for us, for Caucasian women, than feminism, because a lot of times the family is de-emphasized. It has been traditionally. So how is it that we work into that? And it was really interesting. I was flying to South Carolina to speak a couple of years ago, and I had this sudden epiphany. Why the same process I went through in naming and defining the Africana woman, ethnicity and gender, I could do the same thing for any woman. And so in the afterthought of my book, I have this whole thing. What you do is simply append to the name womanism the ethnicity there. And so we have the European womanist, the Asian American womanist, the Native American, the Chicano or Latino, and they loved it. I said, because see, it is no problem there, because the agenda in the 18 characteristics which I've identified, and that list can go on and on. It started off with 7, and now it's 18, but it has the element of authenticity there. It means right there points directly to the naming. What is culturally correct or authentic for you must be dictated by the name, okay? So there's no problem. Nothing changes on the agenda. Everything is taken care of. But that we as women are still concerned with the family, the survival of the family first. I mean, human survival, this is the whole thing. It's more than female empowerment for me. I think that lots of black women, even during the civil rights movement, for example, when they were coming up with tokens, you know, I got job offers because I killed 2 birds with 1 stone. I was a woman and I was black, so I got all these job offers that black men could even get. So I'm saying that the empowerment element is not necessarily one female empowerment that I see as number one. I mean, there are dynamics on an individual basis, and you're going to have males in a patriarchal system, no matter what color you are, flexing muscles and trying to oppress women. I think that we have to stick to the original stance of black male and females. In African cosmology, men and women were equal at inception. And when you're dealing with an agricultural land, you know, that's almost inherent, that you're kind of like working things out. And when I look at Blassingame, for example, the slave community, and even with Angela Davis, you know, talking about when you look at the slave community, there is that, there is that intrinsic, organic equality. You know, there, males and females are equal. Yes. You know, and I want to go back to this original thing. When they start acting up, we just simply say, cut. You know, because most black women will tell you where to get off anyway, unless they have bought into the silence. They will say, oh, that's enough, the end. So this is why I say when you say breaking the silence for black women, I laugh because I hardly know one who needs to break silence.
Yeah,
you know,
we
just don't need to break into silence. You know, that's why they were trying to silence us in the 60s, because we were so verbal, you know. And I think that most of us remain verbal, you know, and black men understand that. You know, and so it's globally, the concept has been internationally embraced. I think the fact that Nigerian Daily Times did a complete exclusive coverage of my presentation when I was there last summer. Zula Sofala, you're familiar with her, endorsed the book and says it's not just a scholarly book, but our own. She sees this coming from us, as opposed to us looking at someone else's concept and saying, how can we eke out of this our space? Or how do we fit into that space? That space to me is that space. I must create my own space. You know, this is the way I look at it.
Yes, I see the difference. While we're dealing with issues of males and females, let me ask you, Dr. Christian, what do you think the role of the black male is in the agenda of black feminism, and do the roles seem to enhance each other, or is there a conflict?
Well, we need to remember historically that black men have been some of the original feminists. Men like Frederick Douglass, for example, have been very strong in terms of the support of women's rights. Because I think that we need to be sure that we understand when we talk about women's rights in relation to black women, that we are talking about both black and women. And that in this country, and to some extent in Africa, there has been a struggle for women's rights, not only for race and sex. Racism and sexism, I want to reiterate again, are related. The way in which Douglass, for example, was oppressed was as a male as much as the way Harriet Tubman was oppressed was as a female. You cannot separate those two since racism was created. If you go anywhere in the world, you see the way in which, as Fanon points out, that the way in which imperialism operates is to try to make men of color into females in a society, like houseboys, for example. That is, we're not just talking about individual women walking around. We're talking about the way in which sex, gender, let me put it that way, is used as a way of being able to impose racism and imperialism in countries all over the world for a very long time, and vice versa. Anyway, that's one thing. The second is that I think that men are not at all in conflict. The whole construct of being a man is part of what feminism, black feminism, must be about. How do you redefine manhood is one of the major questions, as long as you cannot just redefine womanhood without redefining manhood. They are very much related. And I think that men are extremely important in the development of black feminism. I think of someone like the scholar Manning Marable, for example, who's done a great deal in helping to define the political aspects. I want to not only the philosophical, but the political implications of a black feminist critique. The same with Cornel West. There are many, many contemporary men, black men, as well as black women. And I think there's an important reason for that. I think that one of the reasons why so many African-American men, as they learn more and more, especially about their history, can focus on the important needs of their women, in quotes, their women or black women, is because of the role that mothers have played. Mothers have been extremely, black mothers, central to the development of black men as men, black women as women, and the relationship. So I don't see that necessarily. I do not see that as something that is separate. They have to be related.
I think that's a subject we're going to have to explore a little further. When we come back from the break, we'll explore this question and others.
Oh, beautiful, for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain. America, America, from sea to shining sea.
Thousands of forest fires are started by people who never realize what they've done. Some never even set foot in the forest.
It's dawn, and war has come to the desert. Not a real war, but the most realistic aerial combat exercise in the world. It's called Red Flag. Here, dedicated professionals and the latest technology are put to the test. To build teamwork, ensure readiness, and to keep the United States Air Force the best in the world.
Bullseye east 12, 27,000. 31 engaging 340. Bandit melted, heading west.
If you're interested in achieving your potential and feeling the pride of serving your country, we can point you in the right direction. Aim high. Air Force.
What is a man? A man stands proud. A man respects himself. A man shares his strength. A man protects his family. If you're a man with a woman who's pregnant, help her get the care she needs, now. Because if you don't, for help, just call.
We're back with our discussion with Dr. Barbara Christian and Dr. Clenora Hudson-Weems, and we were right in the middle of the issue of the role of black males in these two political, social, and literary agendas. Dr. Hudson-Weems, how do you see the role of the black male in the agenda of the Africana womanist? Is there conflict?
Yeah. No, there isn't. First of all, one of the 18 characteristics that I've identified of the Africana womanist is that she is in concert with the male in the struggle for, you know, equality for the whole, you know, for all of us. So they are, you know, this is the whole thing. It's, as George Latner says, it's the glue that keeps us together. You know, that we do have a struggle, a collective struggle. And we have to realize that and to keep the focus there. Now, I want to go away from what is happening in the academy to what is happening in the community. We talked about, you talked about Cornel West, for example, and some of the male Manning Marble.
There are others as
and
well
there are a lot
in the
of,
community.
But I
Jesse
just want,
Jackson.
just for a difference, I want to go to just the community and not necessarily point out anybody specifically, but to say that for the most part, my experience has been, and I have gone to speak at a lot of places, and I've asked the question, if you go to the average black community and ask the average black woman if she's a feminist, what would the response be? The response overwhelmingly would be no. There was an article that came out in the Black Issue of Higher Education in March 11th, I believe, the race factor, we're dealing with feminism, and that came out very clear with a lot, like one lady in particular who was a returning student, you know, can't think of her name. In that same article, Julie Hare made the statement that black feminism is not a word that we can use, that we need to find another word, that the white race has a woman problem and the black race has a male and woman problem because we are equally oppressed in some ways, you know. So I'm simply saying that, that in the black community, you know, this whole thing of feminism, and I have to say what I hear from a lot of men, as well as from a lot of women who talk about what the conversations have been between them and the males, that feminism is alienating for them because it has a connotation, it has an aura, it has that whole emphasis on you know, males over here and females over here. I mean, things are happening to try to level it out. In fact, even not Virginia Woolf, but what's her name? Betty Friedan, in the second wave, had to go back and reevaluate the de-emphasis on family that she placed in the feminist mystique. You know, where the family was, you know, and is this all, you know, that type of thing. The limitations of the woman only operating for the male and for the children, and instead of herself. I'm simply saying that in the black community, a lot of black males find it very difficult, and many of them will say, oh, you must be a feminist, when they think that you are not concerned with the whole or with them as much as you're concerned with yourself and the family in general. This is my opinion. I think that, to me, it seems to suggest, from what I hear, that it creates some tensions between the sexes. Because generally, when you think of the feminists, you think of female empowerment, because that's the first thing, that's the most important thing, is empowering the female. That is not the first thing when you think of operating in a black community, in a world where we are systematically discriminated against, you see. And so for that reason, I think, and African womanism has been, I think, you know, received quite well from all the males I've talked to. You know, I mean, they say this is good because at least you're talking about male, females coming together, struggling together, that we do have a struggle together. And if there are problems, we're going to iron it out too. But we still have one real battle that we've got to deal with. And that is what is happening to all of us, men, women, and children. When Harriet Tubman, for example, went down south to get blacks, she did not come for the women folk. She came for all of them. Therefore, it wasn't a female or a gender issue. When Ida B. Wells started the anti-lynching crusade, it was because a male friend of hers was lynched.
That's right.
Okay, because he posed an economic threat to the white community. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I think your assumption is that feminism means exclusively that there is some kind of a 10-point program that begins with point one, female empowerment. Feminism anywhere in the world, or if you want to call it Indian womanism, cannot deal with women without dealing with men, or with families, or with community. What has generally been the case, though, in race struggles so often, and we do struggle, in fact, some of the most important folk struggling for black people are feminists. Very often what happens is because there's an attempt to say what's one and what's two and what's three, to split me up in three parts, as if there's one part of me that's black, and then there's one part of me that's woman, and then there's one part of me that's poor, which is impossible to do. That you get this kind of countdown. So the race question very often, which did happen in the 60s, when you emphasize the race question, very often you say, oh, if you're going to deal about women, you're being divisive. I think the question is trying to see that they are interrelated. They are a three-headed monster, race, class, and gender. They are the question of domination. And because black men are liberated, or black communities are liberated, doesn't necessarily mean that they will not practice domination.
Sure,
So the important issue of seeing that these are attitudes, characteristics that are interrelated is, for me, what's the important thing. That is the struggle. And I hear in so much of the debate going on in this country a way in which people think that they can commit errors or even crimes because they are being oppressed. And usually what that results in is more oppression.
Sure it does.
So that, for me, I think it's important to not see feminisms or womanisms, if you want to call it, because I think we need to put those S's on it, by the way, as not a single agenda. That was the problem with the women's rights movement of the 19th century that was primarily white. That was the problem with the second wave of feminism. And sometimes it's the problem with black movements as well, that they become also single-agendaed. And this is partly why we need to have that interrelationship, because we are black in a lot of different ways. We're not all the same black, monolithic person.
Sure.
Yeah.
Could I respond? Sure. I'm saying that, and also, just like you said, I think that it continues.
That's
it continues today. The feminisms and the agendas that were originally, in some ways, I was at Bryn Mawr, for example, this spring, and a white young lady said to me, she said, you know, I'm so glad to hear you address race, because my best friend is black, and in my classes, and they emphasize in my classes for these feminist courses that we must stick to the issues at hand, that we must deal with the dynamics of the female. She said, and every time we wanted to talk about race, it was like, oh, let's not talk about it, you know. Well, I'm simply saying, I'm not saying that we are so divided. I'm simply saying that we have to deal with things sometimes in the order in which it comes. It may come sometimes a sex issue first, but I'm saying that overall for us, you know, I think about this little scenario from X amount of feet away, they detected that I was black, as you see color from across any room, you know. As I got into closer proximity, they detected I was impoverished, but it wasn't until I got in the door that they knew I was a female. That somewhat suggests to me a notion of, at some point, prioritizing, especially when the race factor comes first. You don't want to dismiss it and say, let's deal with us as women first. This is what happens too frequently.
I agree.
Yeah,
I absolutely agree. And that's why we need black feminists, because you see, white women are white. We keep talking about race. only in terms of blackness or color, but they are white. Their feminism is a white
I
feminism.
know,
That's the
exactly.
way I would put
And that's
it.
the mainstream
And they need to keep
feminist.
learning that. That's why I keep
but
saying.
see, the thing about it is, I understand what you're saying, and we are not really disagreeing
I don't think we are.
too differently. What I'm saying is the term is one that I don't care to fight for.
I am not willing to fight for it either.
Okay, if they
I
have
want the
named it,
agenda.
if they named it feminism, and they have an agenda, I think that it's okay if they want to be true to that agenda. This is
Yes.
what I'm saying. I'm saying that when I get in there and I see it, because I was the National Council of Black Studies, the National Women's Studies Association for a couple of years and got tired of the battle.
Yes.
You know, I said, I didn't come to
I
fight
agree
for
with you.
turf.
I don't
I'm
go there
sick and tired
anymore.
of it, you know. I said, what I decided, hey, there's no problem. If you want feminism to mean this, since you're the ones that picked this term up and said this is what we're going to call it, then you're okay and you're right to want to stick with the original agenda. If that's what you want, fine. There are trillions of words in the universe. I can easily pick out Africana womanism and let it mean whatever I want it to mean, because it's nice and clean. The slide is clean, and that's what I did. I just filled it in. Not that I picked the characteristics out the sky, just the terminology. Because all of this is, all these terms, these concepts, these meanings I've put down have been through my observations.
Yes.
You know, so that no one can disagree with me that the Africana womanist is, for the most part, mothering. We are mothering. We are nurturing. We are respectful of elders. I mean, that's just something that you just see us doing. We are spiritual. You know, we are family-centered. You know, we are self-namers and self-definers. Morrison in Beloved makes the most profound statement. Definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. I choose to be my own definer. I will not be defined or named by anyone. And that's all I'm interested in, is self-naming and self-defining. And then I can take that clean slate and I can fill it in. And it's no problem. You know, this is what I talked about when I was in Africa with the African feminists. And it was why they were able, it was so funny because Odu had made the comment, and I opened my first chapter of my book up with Odu's comment about feminism. You know what we feel about that European concept, the destroyer of families. This is what she says, and I opened it up. And yet Odu gets there at the plenary, and she makes a beautiful, beautiful presentation. I just loved it because I've read her books and taught them and da-da-da. And then all of a sudden she says at the end, long before feminism, I was a feminist.
That's right.
Wait a minute, let me just finish. Yeah. My mother before me and my grandmother before me. Let me just finish. I stood up, and I told her, I enjoyed you immensely until you got to the end, where I disagreed.
Because
long before feminism, you were all that you just said. You were independent, strong, verbal. You were all those great things and more, and your mother and your grandmother. But that did not make you a feminist. You were what you are. The term that you are appending to your activity, as if feminist activity resides or starts in the with the white woman who named it feminism, to me is the ultimate in race chauvinism. You know, because I'm not going to, and I've heard women say, but I'm not going to let them have that term. I'm not going to ask them, why are you fighting for a term? If you have an agenda, then you can give it any term you want to give it. You know, why are you fighting for a term? I mean, it's just a word.
I'm not fighting for a term.
Not you. I'm saying
want
that
the agenda.
This lady said, I'm not going to give it up. I'm not going to let them have it. I've heard her say it, you know. I said, I'm not here to say I'm not going to let them have it. They can have it because they're the ones who said it first. And they're entitled to the term feminism and all the meanings that they want to put into it, that they originally had for it. That's fine. I have no problems with that. I'm saying that for me, I want something nice and clean and crisp that I can say, now here is the agenda from our perspective. This is what we have observed, and this is what we see ourselves doing, and what we've always done. And we're going to name it this. This is the way I feel. Because it's less confusing. We don't have to, you know, debate it anymore, you know, because it's so clean. It doesn't have the baggage. You buy a name, you buy the agenda. You know, even white women now are having problems with the original mission of feminism. I don't have that problem because it wasn't my original mission anyway, you know, so it's nice and clean for me.
I think that your comments and Dr. Christian's really define the differences fairly clearly. And I see that, you know, this is a debate that's not going to end anytime soon.
No.
There are important issues going on in both areas.
Right.
The thing that we need to understand is that this does inform the way we read and the way we write. And you know, the thing that we want our students to understand is that as a person who identifies herself as one or the other, you will respond to literature in a particular way. Dr. Christian, I wanted to ask you specifically about Alice Walker, because Alice Walker has been identified sometimes by her own person and sometimes by others as a feminist, and people tend to read her writings as feminist tracts. And you have examined the works of many contemporary writers of color and Alice Walker has also identified herself as a womanist.
Yes,
now,
right.
I'm not sure that we're clear on what she really means at this point.
See, certainly one of the reasons why she coined that term, womanism, which she did in her book In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, which came out in 1983, was because of the very reasons that Dr. Hudson-Weems is talking about, that she wanted a term that came out of black cultures in womanish, womanist, etc., rather than feminist, which came out of, had a French sound to it from her perspective. What I find interesting about her definition is not only her linking of the way in which racism and sexism, that linkage, or her, not only her positioning women as central, but the way in which that term also relates to her, to the planet, so that part of her definition of womanism has to do with a nurturing and a respecting of life, that is, of the planet itself, of that which grows. So a womanist, for example, she says, loves the moon. A womanist loves, etc. So she's trying to expand the term even beyond issues of structure within society, and relate human society to nature, which has always been one of her concerns. And one of the things that I see with most black feminists, or if you wish to call them African or womanist writers, is the way in which they all seem to do that. They see a relationship between human society and nature. That's one of their very first, which is a very spiritual construct at the center of their work, very seldom discussed, except I think primarily by black women critics. And one of the reasons why I think that is so central to their work is because there's a way in which nature informs the way we relate to each other as human beings, the way in which we relate in terms of family, in terms of the relationship between strength, nurturing, and pleasure, which are all interrelated. You don't just have one with the other. So I think that that's one of the very important things about Walker. Now, I think what distinguishes her, perhaps from some of the other black women writers that you might call, you know, somebody, let's say Morris, who she's often, except that I hate to have them pitted against one another. I'm so tired of that. But any number of other writers, is that it is very clear that one of Walker's concerns, her major agenda, one of her major points in her agenda, has to do with looking within the communities, that is within African American communities, at the way in which women are treated. So that is one of the reasons why she has gotten a lot of bad press. But I mean, I think if you look at her works, just to get back to your point, they are almost always about a family. The Third Life of Grange Copeland, Meridian, they're always about, and the way people treat each other within families. She said about The Third Life of Grange Copeland, and I'm mentioning her first novel because everybody talks about Color Purple. But which is the first part of a trilogy that ends with Color Purple. She looks at the way in which racism affects the black family, a sharecropping black family, the Copelands, so that they turn on one another. That is, you get this sexism within the community, and interestingly enough, children are the ones that are so often abused, because she's a very child-centered writer. Every single one of her novels has a child voice. It's Brownfield and Ruth in The Third Life of Grange Copeland. It's Meridian in Meridian. It's Celie as a young child growing up. Every single one of her novels. So I agree with you. There is that child-centered. But the point is, she has this political critique, a sharp political critique, that suggests that black men need to change. And you see, I think that this may be part of where we may have been a little bit of disagreement. Because as much as I think black men and women are in concert in relation to the struggle against racism, I think there are many ways in which they do need to change in terms of the way they think about womanhood, because they have been informed by a Western domination, And not only that, before the conquering of Africa, there was sexism in Africa as well.
Sure.
So I think that that's where her sharpness comes in terms of being that kind of a writer. And one other thing I do want to say about Walker, increasingly we see the way in which, like in Possessing the Secret of Joy, her last novel, which I think has got some real problems, but also is very courageous, is that she exemplifies for me the way in which black women will not shut up. They will be courageous, even if you disagree with them.
Yes.
Even their communities saying, well, you can't say that. She will say, well, I think that. Now let's have a discussion. Because for me, I think the fiction and the literature should examine issues, should provoke, should not come up with solutions. Fiction is not an aspirin, as Morrison said. It is to help us think about ourselves and how we feel about one another, rather than to say, this is the way we are, because all of us are not the same way. We're not monolithic.
Yeah, I think that there has to be a certain amount of re-education on both sides of the gender line. And when we think about reading as an Africana womanist, if we were to discuss someone such as Zora Neale Hurston, whom you've written on extensively, what kind of issues do you find in Hurston's works that make you think of her that way?
One of the things that sticks out with me, with Hurston and some of the other writers, I like this whole this lean towards this male-female compatibility that they aspire to. When I look at Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God, for example, and I look at the quest of the protagonist, Janie Mae Crawford, for wholeness, and I also look at what is this wholeness and what is it that she's looking for 25 years. The thing that she's looking for, and she has a long time getting there, is the right male companion. She goes through 2 real dodos, okay? And she finally meets one who can respect her as his equal, okay? He gets out of line sometimes. You know, one instance when he roughed her up and everything, but we understand that. They have to be put back in place. See, my thing is that gender issues is not an exclusive for the feminists anyway, because as a woman, I deal with that too. So when someone tries to oppress me on the basis of my sex, I'm going to, strike out. I'm going to resist and say, no, we're not going to have it, okay? And when Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God, when I tell my students that, I said, what is the quest? What is this 25-year quest? And when they suddenly realize she's looking for the right man, they said, hey, that's very strange. You mean the man is that important? I said, yes, he's that important. Whereas when you talk to the feminists, many of them who are even married, they will say that they will have to psychologically and emotionally, if not also physically, separate from the male sector. I never see that need for the white woman to separate, the black woman to separate from the male sector. She's going to find her space anyway, but she doesn't need that separation. You know, it's not defined like that. Morrison's Beloved, for example, I love that. That's my favorite novel, I believe. But I mean, I opened up my 7th chapter or 8th chapter, I think, with this quote of Sixo.
Yes.
And you have Paul D remembering. Paul D is really the other half of Sete. I mean, the two of them, they make a whole. You know, he says, we've had a whole lot of yesterdays. We've got a whole lot of tomorrows. That's what he wants, okay? That's beautiful. But Sixo, and he's remembering Sixo, he says, talking about the 60-mile woman that he goes to see. He says, she gathered me, man. She takes all of my pieces and put them in the right order. It's good, you know, when you got a woman who's a friend of your mind.
Yeah, that's the dream.
You see, he's not thinking of her as something under him. I mean, she's his equal. You find that in Terry McMillan. I mean, there's a lot of problems with Disappearing Acts, but I love that novel. This man has all the intentions of doing right by this woman.
Yes.
Poor thing, and he keeps getting knocked back because of racism. He gets knocked. He's the last hired and the first relieved. And it gets to the point that he takes it out on her, in much the same way that Alice Walker's characters do, male characters do. He takes it out on her, but at some point she has to have enough respect for herself, which I think we have to do, and that's one of the characteristics of the African woman, demanding respect and recognition, to say enough is enough. You're not going to do this to me. It's time for you to go. So she allows him the space to redeem himself. He leaves her, and he says, I will not go back to her until I can look at her in her face and say, I'm sorry. It took 3 months to do it. And when he went back, he was ready. He was ready to deal with her as his equal. See, because he had lost it. He was acting totally inauthentically.
Yes.
I mean, there was no reason for him to be jealous of this woman. Black women have always worked. They have always brought their salary in to help. It took the two to tango. So what is your problem now? So you've lost a job. They have lost jobs many times.
That's right.
You know, in fact, many have conjectured that this has been a tool that the dominant culture has used to further emasculate the black man. So what is your problem? Am I your enemy? No, I'm not your enemy. And you will not take your hostility out on me. So she's, you know, she calls a halt to it. Miriam Abah, Senegalese writer. Her whole novel, So Long a Letter, attacks this phenomenon of polygamy. Right. And it's because she's in this society. She's in this culture in Senegal where the dominant religion is Islamic, that has been brought in, although Islamic religion did not bring in polygamy. That's right. Because Diop talks about that even before, but it was mostly practiced among the elite, very few. But it's widespread now where almost everybody's practicing polygamy. And with polygamy means female subjugation, which she's fighting. But this woman in this novel says, I cannot imagine life without a male. And she cries in the end that she wants this family thing, because this is the only way the human race is going to perpetuate itself, is with male-female dynamics, working it out together. We've got to do it at some point together, otherwise we're going to lose it. We've got to come back together. And what she says at the very beginning, before the novel opens, is that she wants to get to the original stance of the African culture, the way it was before it began to duplicate female subjugation.
But we're almost out of time. We have just about 1 minute left for a closing comment from each of you, Dr. Christian.
I am not wedded to any terms quite yet, because I have seen terms come and go so quickly. I mean, having been through some of the changing of terms, for example, in the 1960s. But what I am concerned about is that we understand that there is this relationship between sexism, racism, and class, that it is not enough just for us to celebrate our own culture. We must do that, but we also must critique it. And we must be concerned with looking at issues of justice as well as issues of celebration. And I know, because African Americans, African Caribbeans, people of the African diaspora have been wounded in many ways, but are also extremely strong. Yes. That sometimes we forget that we must critique ourselves. And I think that's one of the things I've got to do with students. I've got to ask them to critique.
Okay. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today. We're out of time.